Okay, all right, there we are. And the camera's on your back. We'll fix that, hold on. The camera's just, it seems to do that. It seems to
Go
just...
on and off.
Yeah, but it needs to like find a target first. Right here. Right here, camera.
You can also do, change the preset on and off. There you go.
There we are. Oh, it's focused on you, Diana.
Oh, hey, it likes me.
Indeed.
You start walking around, it'll follow you.
Hopefully. So, yep, we're currently still waiting on Christian, but we will get started in a second. Hopefully people can see us on the stream. We'll drop that in the announcement in a second. Drop the, we'll drop it in the announcement. Yeah. Cool. Cool. Camera? Hello, camera? Please? If I start, do you think the camera likes Unity or Unreal Engine more?
Oh,
hey, there
my
we go. No, just start the
We're not starting.
argument. There we go. All right. Oh man, how many of you came to the last meeting? Okay, cool. Just making sure. Okay, so there's a good handful of new people. So those of you that are new, welcome. It's good to have you. I have a feeling a lot of you might have joined because you saw me or Morgan or Diana in one of our digital arts and sciences classes where we presented and talked a little bit about this club. This is our first like full workshop, but we did already have a meeting. It is recorded and it talks in quite a bit of detail about how this club operates, what our schedule is for the semester, how our Discord works, some interesting statistics about us, just all sorts of the things that we're currently up to, because we are up to a lot. So I won't bother the majority of those in attendance with going over the stuff that we already talked about in that past meeting, but at a later time, maybe, like if you have any questions or something about like what this club is normally like, you're more than welcome to ask. Today we're doing a PowerPoint on Unity. We're especially focusing on subjects that are kind of the sorts of things that I think beginners want to learn but haven't learned yet that would make them intermediate users. There's a lot of people that are really late to the game when it comes to like source control, for example. They do a lot of game development in their lives and they don't even decide to use like Git or another source control solution until really late in their experience. And I think that's unfortunate. So we're covering like source control in Unity a little bit. We're covering some things related to platforming. The reason we're focusing on platformers is because that's what this workshop was originally suggested as by Brian, who's not in this room. He's currently holding the door, and he'll be back in a minute. But a solid year ago, in our suggestions channel, there was a workshop suggestion for a workshop that focused on 2D platformers as a way to do like introductory Unity things and relatively intermediate Unity things. And so yeah, that's what this workshop today is. It's us following through on the democracy of our suggestions channel. In fact, I'll see if I can pull it up, but unfortunately, it's a long story in which I accidentally deleted a channel for the first time on our server, and with it like a handful of suggestions. That happened over the summer, so it's no longer with us, but in the suggestions channel right here is where those happen. Hey, there's Christian. So Christian's going to be giving today's PowerPoint. We are streaming and recording, but we haven't started. I was just giving like just talking. I'll pull it up. We should probably go get Brian then. I told him that I'd tell him. Thank you, Diana. Okay, cool, sure. Yeah, okay. Oh, it already focused on you. It knows. It knows who the. That's great. That's great. Auto tracking is going well. Okay. So, but yeah, before Christian starts talking, I guess just a couple things about the club. So, yeah, welcome, GBM to. We'll actually adjust the lighting a little bit. I think, yeah, that's a little bit better maybe. Okay. So some brief updates. First of all, our website. As of this morning, it's updated. So if you're the kind of person that uses our bot, if your name is like Andrew and you have 450 posts, all 450 of those posts are now visible and explorable on our website. Anyone that's ever used our bot to like show off different parts of the, is he up there?
Yeah.
Is he coming down?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So, hey, there's Brian. So, yeah, if you use our website and you use the bot, you can now see the update history for the projects that you're all working on. Currently, I think, in fact, if I go to our website right now, we might be able to show that off real quick. I haven't actually tested it yet. This has been entirely a product of William's effort. So here's our website. And if we scroll down and click on, say, this, yep, there we go. So you can see project updates now. And if you navigate to your own project, like for example, if we go to, I don't know which one of these is Andrew's, but let's look at Christian's, shall we? What is it? Buckethead Universica, Studio Coleman. Sure. We should see, so here's the list of the past updates without thumbnails yet or much styling, but we'll, I think this is definitely a good start. So we're working on it. We're working on it. Aside from the website updates, which is awesome, we've had a number of suggestions in the last week and a half. So there's 4 of them. There's 5 total. We'll look at the 5th one in a second. But first one's gym day. I made that one. I was like, all right, let's go to the gym. And a lot of people seem to like that. So executive decision, this coming Friday, 6:30 to 8:30, we'll be meeting at Southwest Rec. You're welcome to come if you want to. At least 14, 15 people are going to be there. And we go gym. So we go gym. We'll go to the gym together and have a good time. It's going to be a Friday, so hopefully a lot of the people that spend their Monday through Thursday working out are partying, and we'll be able to chill. Now, what else? A workshop on 3D character game animation by Brian over there recommended that one. So we will be doing that later in the semester, assuming that no more interesting workshops with more votes get proposed. But right now that looks like it's happening. So there's 2 slots towards the end of the semester where top voted workshop suggestions will be executed. So we'll cover 3D character animation. That means procedural animation, inverse kinematics, rigging, physical animation, all sorts of cool systems like that. Christian proposed VR games. VR games got some upvotes and downvotes. I think that's because of the accessibility of VR and VR headsets, and if you wanted to learn VR development on your own, you kind of need access to some of that technology, but it's still pretty cool, and if you like it, go upvote it, right? Yeah, and a workshop on game physics and movement systems by Liam, which I think was just made, that's why it's missing too many things. And then we also got this suggestion from Brian, which is a really good suggestion, and it's a suggestion to start using abstention voting on the suggestions. So we'll do that. We'll start having a P option, P as in pass. So just to get a better idea of who looks at the suggestion but doesn't actually care about it. Because that's, a fraction of people typically, right?
I think it actually means it was originally meant to mean present because
present.
in Congress it'd be aye, nay, or just present.
I see. Yep. So present, pass, abstain. But yeah, we go gym again. New event posted on the Discord. Yep. Also, 120 new people in the last 2 weeks. Really exciting stuff. Something about this club is that we don't really, growth isn't. It's not about growth for the sake of growth. I don't care if there was 1,000 people today or 50 people today, as long as we're putting out value. But it is exciting to see us grow so much. I think a lot of digital arts and science students got to see that we very much are the hub of digital arts and science on campus. And a solid 120 people joined. We were 680, 650 all summer. We're up to 812. We passed a couple of other organizations on the Discord listings. So really cool stuff. We also have the highest engagement ratio of any of those organizations on there, just based on how much we use our Discord and how many events we host, how many people come. So yeah, and then I'll pass it off to Christian. Without further ado, Christian's got several years of experience in Unity. He's one of the most experienced, I think, game devs when it comes to Unity, probably in this room, probably. So yeah, all right. This isn't actually recording. This is just to make your voice sound cool. If you project your voice, it doesn't even matter.
Sure.
But yeah, feel free to. I don't know.
Okay, I'll do it
Do whatever. Yeah.
So yeah, like Ryan suggested about game physics and movement, I think that's better covered in its own workshop. So today I just want to give an overview of Unity specific features, how to use them, general practices, stuff that works well. And then if there's any questions about anything that I'm talking about today, feel free to ask at the end. And also, if you want a deep dive into anything, I don't go super into detail about any specific thing. There's a lot more to be said about singletons and events than I could cover in 1 hour. So if that's something that you're interested in, definitely put in the suggestions so that we know to keep talking about it and go more into detail. Spacebar?
Sure.
Sweet. Okay, so we'll start with source control.
Before we get started, I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
I didn't mean, how many of you I'm curious, how many of you would call yourselves beginners in Unity? Okay, cool. How many of you would call yourselves like no experience in Unity? Okay, intermediate? Yeah, okay, cool. All right, yeah, that's fair. Don't feel bad, right? Anyone that would call themselves like an advanced user? Okay, just wanted to know our audience. Hey, Julian.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I try to include something for everyone. There should be some really high level stuff in there, but also a lot of just basics if you're just getting set up. So if you're doing game development, use source control. There's no way around it. Google Drive is not a valid form of source control. You can lose a lot of progress. I know from experience. Don't repeat my mistakes. So GitHub's pretty standard in the industry. Perforce is obviously for bigger companies, but GitHub is free. It's pretty easy to use, even if you don't have programming experience. So I definitely recommend using it. If you're using Unity, there's the Unity for GitHub plugin, which is very nice, but no longer officially supported. So who here is familiar with source control? Okay, who's not familiar with source control? Okay, so source control tracks the changes that you make in a project file by file. So you change an art asset or you change a line of code, your source control tracks it, and basically you're running a local repository and an online repository. All your code that you have on your machine is in a local repository. Every time you make changes to it, it tracks it, and then you can compile all of these changes into one commit and then push that to your online repository. So if you throw your laptop into a lake or whatever, it's on the cloud and you can get it back. Or you accidentally break your game and realize 3 months later that you deleted your entire movement system, you can go back to where your movement system was working and then get it back. Basically just prevents you from messing up in a bunch of ways. And also collaboration is huge. If you have more than one person working on a project, you have to have source control. There's no way around it. GitHub's really good about it, so I'd recommend it. Yeah. Google Drive is not. Oh no. You can come with compilation. No.
4 years. Yeah, that's don't use Google Drive. Don't use
Yeah.
Google Drive for your source control.
There's a game called Uncivil War. Never made it to market because it was source controlled in Google Drive. 4 years and a team of 35 people, and the school district deleted the email that was holding it. So
Yeah.
I still have a bunch of the assets. I could put it back together if I wanted. So it's like it was backed up in 3 places. It's just I don't know. We lost about a year of work.
For those of you that are completely new to source control and you're hearing words like commit and repository that might not mean anything to you, we have a video that actually goes like for half an hour on just how to use Git, what exactly Git is, Git and GitHub. Like you're hearing GitHub, you hear Git, you hear SCN, you hear SVN, and you don't know what these things mean. They're all different protocols or hosting systems, and we go into detail on that in there's Come in, it's okay. Just that. That's all I'm saying. Like, don't stress too much about it, but you'll still be able to get some good content from this presentation.
I think on a later slide I try to explain all the pieces.
Yeah.
There's a couple links here. I think the actual URLs are hidden now, but I'll post this after this so you can get access to them. Unity.github.com. You can get the Unity GitHub plugin. Git-stm.com, you can get Git, which is the programming language that Git and GitHub run on. And then Git Credential Manager allows you to log into GitHub on your computer, which isn't supported by default. Weird programming decision.
True.
How do you feel about plastic SCM?
It's pretty cool. The 3-member limit for the free trial or free version is kind of limiting. Even in a game jam, you probably have 5.
So
So if you're comfortable paying for it, then yeah.
Julian's asking about a source control version that it's called Plastic SCM. It's relatively newish, but it has like official support for Unity, but it has paid limitations. Git is a free and open source protocol that also works with GitHub, which is like the home of open source, right?
Yeah.
So,
I would say Plastic is objectively better, but the limitations of being paid, not open source, and member limits make GitHub better for me. But Plastic's system of locking files is definitely better than GitHub's. So that if you're working on a team of 30 people, the locks would definitely be useful. But yeah, I like the Unity for GitHub plugin. It's not officially supported by Unity anymore. It is officially supported by GitHub. They've got to come to an agreement at some point. 2020.3.25 works with the plugin. 2020.3.38 doesn't. I checked this morning. 2021 doesn't, and 2022 doesn't. So if you want to use the plugin, 2020.3.25 is the last one that I've confirmed works. You don't lose out on too many features. Unity updates all of their versions. So 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022, they update them with all the new features that they roll out. So you're not actually 2 or 3 years behind. Yeah.
Why is the plugin not supported on like the newer versions? That feels weird to like take out a feature.
So the plugin is made by GitHub for Unity. Unity rolled out Plastic, their official source control, so now they no longer officially support the GitHub plugin. You can still use GitHub without the plugin in any version of Unity. So if you're comfortable with Git Bash or the Git GUI, those are good options. I think the GitHub Unity plugin is the cleanest and easiest interface, especially for artists who aren't comfortable writing code. I think it's just a really nice interface to use. In the newer versions, it gets stuck refreshing files. It refreshes a file every second, so you can never push, which is kind of an issue. But yeah, it's pretty simple setup process. I'm not going to get into it. I don't think it's worth it right now, but you can take a screenshot. Yeah.
It's kind of weird asking a question about Git, but this is always something I've wondered about GitHub. I'm pretty sure that they have it so you can make as many private repositories as you want for free.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. What's the catch? Because I feel like there's got to be a catch.
When you start making a whole lot of money, or you start working with teams of hundreds of people, or you start using gigabytes or terabytes of storage, then you start paying for the pro.
there's bandwidth limitations as
Yeah.
well, but generally GitHub is very comfortable with them. So if you exceed the bandwidth limitations that GitHub sets, they email you. They're like, please stop.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they don't mind too much, and they'll start charging you sooner or later. But like, you know, Microsoft's very good about GitHub.
Yeah, I was gonna say big companies like Microsoft and not Amazon anymore. They don't use that I'm aware of, but the big FANG companies, the AAA studios, etc. They use GitHub so much that they pay for everyone else who uses it in tiny amounts, like 20 projects and 6 gigabytes. It's tiny numbers in the big scale of things when they have petabytes of storage. So
Another thing is that William notes in the chat that one thing to note is that Git was designed for code and text files, while Preforce and Plastic are designed for text and binary files.
So
yes,
this is
absolutely.
The difference here is you'll hear the term version control and you'll hear the term source control. Source control typically refers to text documents. We're talking source files, like code files. Version control is more generic. It's a superset of source control. Version control refers to the version of an image or a texture or a whatever art file, 3D model. 3D models can be version controlled. Source control, more for text.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying. Plastic is objectively better for this. You can run into some issues with the binary files for your assets or prefabs or scenes or images or 3D models, etc., being hard to version control through source control. But 99% of the time it does its job well, and if you get comfortable using it, you can navigate around that 1% of time that you accidentally override a prefab or something. So it works really well. Never had to spend more than an hour per project fixing stuff on GitHub. But yeah, GitHub for Unity, make a Unity project, open Git Bash, run the commands that GitHub gives you. You can find the full instructions to this if you just make a new GitHub repository and make sure it's empty. GitHub will tell you which lines of code you actually need to type in the terminal to run the project. Git ignore.
So, yeah, just some details about what git ignore does for those of you that are uninitiated. Git ignore ignores file types. I'll let you talk about
Yeah.
it. Christian. I don't want to interrupt you. I'm
No,
sorry.
you're good. You'll find that if you don't have a git ignore and you launch a Unity project, it'll tell you that you have 12,738 new files. So you're going to hit that file limit pretty quickly. You put a git ignore in there and there's 78. So you just saved 12,000 files that are not being stored on your project because Unity generates the files when you open up the project. You don't need to store them because they're Unity specific files, not specific to your game. So git ignore, Unity has the official one on their website, so you can get it pretty easily. You just slap it in your folder. When you have the plugin installed, you can open it up from the window. Just go window GitHub. It'll show up right next to your inspector. On the sidebar, it'll list all the changes you've made to your project since your last commit. So you can select which ones you want to keep. You can right-click any one of them to discard it, which is why I prefer this over Git GUI, is you have a visual of what files you've changed, what folders they're in, what type of file they are, what type of change you've made, and you can discard the changes you've made to them directly from Unity, so you never have to run any other programs. When you're done with them, you can click all, select all of your files, type a commit message at the bottom, and then click commit to branch. If the commit to branch is grayed out, it means you didn't type a commit message. If you did type a commit message and it's grayed out, click none, then click all, and it works. Literally the only bug with the plugin that I've come across. But yeah, so I think this is a good time to talk about commits, pushes. Commit is one piece of work, one singular piece of work, one feature, one full change. You can make 100 commits per each time you push. You can make one commit per each time you push, but you don't want to, add a boss, health bar, inventory system, player movement physics, procedural generation, and then make that in one commit. When you realize your procedural generation doesn't work, you now have to decide whether or not you want to keep your boss. Not a good decision to have to make. So you can avoid that by just making atomic commits, one single unit of work, one commit. So here, change the play button in the main menu, push that as one commit. The order that you want to run GitHub in is fetch. You first check if there's any files or commits on the online version of the repository that you don't have on your local machine yet. Fetch tells you if there's any. If there are, you can run pull. If there aren't, you're good to go. Then you commit your changes, and then you push your committed changes. You can run push at the end of your development session, but just run commit several times throughout. If you try to push before pulling, if there are changes, it's going to give you a really scary looking error message that doesn't tell you anything. So if you get a really scary error message, it's because you didn't pull or your computer is actually crashing on you. But yeah, very important. That's why William has over 5,000 commits, is he's very good about this. One change, one commit, and then just push 100 changes at a time.
Even if it's like a single line of code,
Yeah.
you just commit it. Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is a good time to stop for questions for GitHub specifically before we move on. Anyone have anything specific? Do you understand all the terms I'm throwing around?
There's a lot of content. There's a
Yeah.
lot of content to get, and there's so much, right? There's like rebasing and like Git large file storage. Like
Yep.
there's a lot more features to Git than we could possibly cover here. But we wanted to give a bit of an introduction. So, if you do have more detailed questions, you can always stick around afterwards. I have some markers. We could draw a Git tree.
Yeah. How many of you would say you feel comfortable using GitHub?
Cool. All right. Great stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, that's solid.
That's good. All right. Prefabs.
Yeah.
Probably the best feature in Unity. And there is an equivalent in Unreal as well. I don't remember what it's called. I think it's just asset. In Unreal, it's just asset.
Blueprints.
Oh.
Blueprints, I
Oh.
think. Yeah, Unreal
Once.
Engine reuses the word blueprint in like 5
Yeah.
different contexts. They call it a class, they call it, but blueprints can be used for kit bashing in Unreal Engine, and they do the
Okay.
same thing. Yeah.
Sweet. So prefabs, use them, please. They're a replicable piece of work. So if you guys are familiar with coding, you don't want to write the same line of code twice when you could make it a function. Same thing in Unity, you don't want to make the same asset twice when you could use a prefab. Especially say you're making an enemy and you want to change something about the enemy, you change the enemy's health in one scene, but the enemy's also in another scene. Now you have to go through every single scene in your game and change the enemy's health value, or you want to add a new component to it, or change literally anything. If it's not a prefab, you have to do it every single time, and you accidentally delete an enemy, you lose all your work. Prefab saves that asset into a file, which means it can be version controlled, which means you don't lose your work if you accidentally delete it. And you can mess around with the values of a prefab and then reset it to its original. So you can mess around with player jump height, and you find out that you don't like that, you can just click revert and it'll go back to the original. So some examples of prefabs: a player, an enemy, a pickup, a game system. I use prefabs for game systems such as UI managers, game manager, spawn managers, projectiles, visual effects, UI elements. Entire game UI should be a prefab. So for example, the entire game's UI is a prefab because you have the same UI in every scene. So you make changes to the UI in one scene, it should be reflected in all the scenes. So it should be a prefab. In the UI, there is an inventory screen, which you can switch between different inventories. So each inventory should be a prefab. The inventory screen can contain multiple items, so each item in that inventory screen should also be a prefab. So you can nest these as deep as you want. Oh, sure.
Okay, well, actually, it might look like you're going to get to this, but what shouldn't be a prefab?
Sure.
You'll get to that, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what should be a prefab? Anything that appears more than once in your game. Different enemies, enemy variants, stuff like that. What shouldn't be a prefab is something that you only use once and isn't very specific. So say in one level you have, I don't know, I would say almost everything should be a prefab. So, but if you have something like some game object that's specific to one level and you want to lose your work if you accidentally delete it, then you don't make it a prefab. But don't go crazy on making every part of every component a prefab. Like, don't have a prefab that consists of 5 prefabs. It's already a prefab, everything's already saved. Unless you're repeating the components of an object multiple times in different objects, you can just have a parent prefab and everything in it is not a prefab. So be sparing with nested prefabs, but not with actual prefabs.
This is this is the variants, the prefab variations.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, which is your next slide, I think.
Yeah. No, prefab variations are very cool.
So you can see this guy is generating some variations of this like SpiderBot prefab, and I think he renames one of them to be like SpiderBot small, and then he changes the movement speed of another one, but they're all fundamentally the same prefab. Well, they all, there's a single like parent prefab, and they're all children of it, but Christian will talk about that in the next slide.
If you guys are familiar with inheritance in code, prefab variants are the exact same thing. You have a parent prefab and child prefab. You make changes to the parent, they're reflected in all the children. So for example, an enemy has specific components to it. Like here in the video, the parent prefab is the complete enemy spider, but the prefab variants are different sizes of it, or they have different health values, do a different amount of damage, etc. If you want to change how the spider model looks, you can change it in the parent, and all the children are reflected, and it's very powerful.
Can the child also have kids?
Yes.
Good.
Infinite variants. So yeah, here's an example. 4 different types of enemies. Each of them has the same components: sprite render, rigid body, collider, enemy controller script, enemy character script, audio source, and all of them are slightly unique. They each have a different script attached to them. Something custom enemy, maybe swarm enemy, cannon enemy, something like that. The base enemy character prefab shouldn't be used in the game at all. You just make a prefab that defines what the enemy is and guarantees that every enemy has all the same components, and then you make variants of it that implement custom enemy and have some kind of difference in them in the script. But yeah, advantages, I think I went through most of these. Better version control, there are files, they're .prefab files, which if you can read binary, you can edit them directly. Quite impressive. I don't know how you do that. But yeah, they are files, you could read them. They can be replaced on your versions through version control. If your artist makes a new prefab, you can just throw it in your game and replace the existing one with it.
I didn't realize they were binary.
They're
So does
think
that
they're
mean that they
hacks.
will merge conflict on version control?
sometimes.
Interesting.
So if you work on a prefab in 2 different branches and your artist changes the model and you add a new script to it, GitHub will sometimes give you a merge conflict because it doesn't know how to merge them. But if you open up the merge conflict editor, you should see that they're just 2 different lines of code. They're like, I think they're JSON.
Okay, sure.
So it's like a text description and then followed by a long number. But you can just add both of the different lines in the conflict to the file and then it'll work.
William says prefab files are stored as text if you have the setting set up correctly.
Mhm.
And then he says
That's
text
the default now.
serialization is default now.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So they're no longer stored as binary. Good to know.
It's good. I didn't know that. But yeah, deleting an object in CMU doesn't reset your progress. It's a huge thing. You're working on an enemy character and you forget to make it a prefab, and then you delete it. Now you have to put together everything again. And that's the biggest advantage of prefabs is it's one whole put together asset. So you can have a 3D model, and that's one complete asset. But an enemy that has a 3D model and the sound system and the scripts that are attached to it, etc., that's a lot better to have as a prefab. And they can also be spawned through code. You run instantiate and give a reference to a prefab, and it'll create a new instance of that prefab in the game. So for infinite games, for example, you can store a reference to a prefab in some script, and then every X seconds run instantiate, and it'll just spawn new enemies through code. If you try to not use prefabs, it's a couple hundred lines of code to spawn one new asset or enemy. Maybe you can do it in 70 lines of code, but it's like 70 lines of code versus 1. It's a pretty easy choice for me. And also, modifying prefabs outside of the prefab editor, which I'll get into a little bit, not too much. If you make changes to a prefab outside of the prefab editing mode, it'll show all of the changes you've made in the prefab menu, but won't apply them to the original. So you can either apply them to the original prefab if you like your changes, or revert them back to the original if you don't. Okay, yeah, prefabs are great. How do I use them? Just drag an asset into the project window. That's pretty much it. You take an object from the hierarchy and drag it into the project window, and it becomes a prefab. You can tell prefabs from prefab variants. Prefabs are completely blue. Prefab variants have shading on the left side, so you can see which prefabs are variants of which ones. Also, if you click on a prefab variant, it'll have an option at the top, something along the lines of show parent or go to original. But yeah. And then reverting. This is a complicated example, but yeah, in the UI, I changed the position of one of the UI elements a little bit. And if I like it, I can click apply all. If I don't like it, I can click revert all. And if I only want something, you can click any specific change you have in that list, and then click apply selected or revert selected. And then that'll apply to the original prefab, and it gets reflected in all the scenes in the game. Inscriptible objects. These are a bit more complicated to explain why you'd want to use them if you're not familiar with programming. But basically, they're prefabs buffer data, and they store some kind of persistent data. So, for example, enemies, if you want enemies to always have the same amount of health, but you want to be able to change that, you want your designers to be able to change that while designing for the game, you can make their health a scriptable object with a variable type float, and then store that in your file storage. Your designers can go into the scriptable object and then change the value of the enemy health, and multiple different, sure.
Would a scriptable object, would that be used for something like difficulty? Like if you increase difficulty, scripted object changes to this, or would that be something else?
You could. So if your difficulty is a complex system, you can have so scriptable object, first of all, is a class. So it has functions, it has variables, it can have private variables, so you can make it as complicated as you want. And then it gets instantiated as a file in your storage. So if you want to have difficulty, have, for example, how long should wave last on this difficulty? How many enemies should be spawned per wave on this difficulty? How much health does the player have on this difficulty? You can make that into a scriptable object, and then you can have a scriptable object called difficulty easy, difficulty medium, difficulty hard, and then in code you can swap references to them. So, yeah.
What are some other examples of scriptable objects?
I think there's some on the next slide. No. So for one of my recent games, Universica, I defined each wave as a list of different enemies that can be spawned on that wave as a scriptable object. So I have somewhere around 16 different scriptable objects, each of which are defining which enemies can be spawned on this wave, and then they're in a list, and it picks a random wave from that scriptable object list. But the biggest advantage of it is giving access to designers or people who aren't super confident with writing code to be able to change parts of the game. Game balancing is a huge part. Storing data that you want stuff to have access to. Scriptable objects work very similar to the inspector, but they take the inspector out of the game and into a file. So scriptable objects don't have to exist in the game at runtime. Like when you launch the game, the scriptable object doesn't have to be instantiated. You can instantiate it through code. And they also store the data while the game is in play mode. So if you've ever made a change to the player, say the players jump height while you're running the game, and then you pause the game, you'll notice that the player's jump height resets back to the original. Scriptable objects don't do that. If you change them in play mode, the changes are reflected once you stop the game. So they're very powerful for designing things really quickly, because you don't have to pause and play the game constantly. Does that answer your question sufficiently? Okay, sweet. But yeah, also, I/O. You can have instances of scriptable objects in your file system, and you can read and write them with get and set commands. So you don't have to do the open file, read line, write line, close file. You can just get a variable from the scriptable object instance, and it will return the current value. And you can also set the current value if you want, just by writing scriptable object dot value equals something. So they're very quick and easy. Here's an example of one. An important part here is the create asset menu at the top and system.serializable. You have to make sure that the class is of type scriptable object and is a serializable object, otherwise it won't work. You could technically not have create asset menu, but you're never going to be able to make an instance of this type of object. So the first one is file name. When you create an object in the create menu, what is it called by default? And the second one is menu name. Where in the menu is it called? So I like to have a folder called scriptable objects. You should be able to see that in a second. But this is just a regular .cs script. So this is waveobject.cs. You just create C# script, replace mono behavior with scriptable object, add system.serializable, and then add create asset menu, and it'll be a scriptable object. And you can treat it just like any other class. So this one has a function get random object, and then it has a weighted object list. It just gets a random object from the list of wave objects. And this is the actual interface. So it's really user-friendly for designers. This one specifically has the number of enemies and what type of enemies a wave spawns. So designers can adjust the values very easily. Maybe on wave 1, 4 enemies is too little, so they can tweak that, put that up to 6. The game has a reference to the scriptable object that the designer never has to know about. They don't have to mess with where is it plugged in, because the game is already aware of its existence. And so it's just a really nice, clean interface for designers to work in. And if you're working in a solo team, I'm using team roles like designers and artists and engineers. If you're working on a solo team, you're all of those jobs. But that doesn't mean you don't have to make your life easier. I think it's a good practice to think of the other roles when you're developing, even on a small team. Because when you do work on a bigger team, you don't want to all of a sudden get into a fist fight with your designer because you're expecting them to have a master's degree in computer science to be able to understand your code. If you make things user-friendly, you will thank yourself 2 weeks later. So I think it's absolutely worth thinking of doing different things in a game as the different roles that would usually be doing that in a bigger team. Debug tools. So this is something Unity specific as well. In Unity, at the top of the window, there's file, edit, asset, window, tools, I think. You can add your custom tools to that menu and access them from the Unity file menu. So here's an example of that. This is Debug Tools. This is very powerful for playtesting. I'm sure you guys enjoy playing your own buggy games as you're making them and seeing them get less buggy over time. But you can save hundreds of hours by making debug tools. I've saved close to 50 hours on Universica after writing this on playtesting because I want to test how the power-ups in the game work, and I don't want to wait until a power-up gets spawned in the game by RNG to see if it works, and then play the game for another 15 minutes hoping I get this super rare power-up, when I can write a line of code called create power-up, which creates that specific power-up that I'm looking for in the game when I press Control-Shift-1. So it makes playtesting super quick and easy. Something important to note is if you want to use these debug tools, you have to make sure that your game has a folder called resources, and in resources you have a folder called prefabs. So if you look at that line here, var loaded object equals resources.load prefabs powerups. In order to use these debug tools, your game has to be organized in a way that your top folder is assets, then resources, and then in resources you have everything that you might want to spawn. So it would be assets, resources, prefabs, and then I have power-ups under prefabs, and then the name of the actual power-up. And then you can just use instantiate to instantiate it like any other prefab. The only thing to note here is the debug tools have to be static functions. So that means that they can't reference any part of the game except other static parts of the game. So I don't think there's any references. No, there's no references in here. You could reference a singleton, for example, or another static part of the game, but this won't run unless it's static. But because it's static, it also means that this will work in editor mode. So you can press, for example, in this, you can press Control-Shift-1 and it'll spawn that power-up in editor mode before you hit play. And I think, yeah, there's an example of it. So that's my debug tool list. Speed up my playtesting process. Every time I want to see if, say, the 8 times score power-up works, I can just press Control-Shift-1 or Shift-2. Yeah, Shift-2. Same thing with enemies. If I want to test a specific enemy, I can just press the keybind for the enemy, or I can go into my debug tools menu and just select what I want to spawn in here. Maybe you want to test a specific part of your game. You can write a line of code that teleports your player to the part of the game they want to test and sets the game state to be in the state they want to test, and so on. I've seen bigger studios have close to 10 parent level menus and then a couple hundred lower level menus. Very, very powerful tools that if you don't know about, you'll never accidentally use, but they're very easy to make. Yeah. And then tiles was something that was requested in the suggestions. There's a lot more you can do with tiles than what I'm going to get into here. But before I get into that, any questions about prefabs, scriptable objects, or debug tools? Yes?
So debug tools basically, they just let you call like other methods in the game while it's in play mode.
Yes, but also in edit mode. So you can only call static functions. Also important to note, your debug tools doesn't have to be named debug tools. If you have multiple classes of different functionalities, they can be named whatever. The name isn't special. It is the menu item line of code, the static function, and the if Unity editor. You don't want to accidentally give your players cheat codes, having the player instantly kill all enemies on screen every time they press Control-Alt-2. Maybe that's a feature, but probably not. So you want to surround all of your code with hashtag if Unity editor, and then at the end put hashtag end if. But that's all you need for it to work. and you can use it in play mode or editor. You can only use it in editor, but you can use it in play mode or edit mode, as long as they're static functions. Yeah.
Does it work with the new input system or the old one, or does it matter?
Oh, it doesn't use the input system.
Oh, it's just.
It uses your keyboard. It's a Unity command. So
Okay.
anything you can keybind in Unity, you can keybind in your debug tool.
Gotcha.
Yeah, tiles. Tile maps are very powerful if you're making a 2D game, especially one that has maybe a Mario or Zelda-like aesthetic, NES aesthetic, pixel art. Tile maps are very powerful. You can use the paintbrush tool to draw your maps, literally draw them. This one's a little dark. I think there's a more bright example after this, but you have a tile palette, sort of like a painter. You can click on any of the blocks and then click on the paint tool and then just draw your map. And as long as you use the rest of the tools, Unity will automatically generate a map hitbox for you, so you don't have to go in and hitbox it yourself. And it's a lot better than just making a single block and then a hitbox on that, and then hand placing hundreds of those in your map. You'll find that your performance quickly goes to 1 frame per second if you try and do that. So this is a lot better alternative. But yeah, it's very simple. This is a setup that I like to have all the map objects in a parent empty game object, and then level geometry has all of the tile map. So you have to have a parent object that has the grid component to it. You can have a rectangular grid, you can have a hexagonal grid. I think there's other options too, but those are the two main ones that you want. And then as children of your grid, you would have all of your tile maps. So, for example, all the ground tiles here have a tile map, they have a tile map render, and they have a tile map 2D collider. So you'll notice that the spikes there at the bottom are not part of the ground tiles map, they're part of the hazard tiles map. So the hazard tiles map has the hazard script attached to it. If the player collides with any tile in the hazard tiles, it counts as hitting a hazard, the player dies. And the tile map collider combines all of the colliders of the blocks that you've drawn together. But that only works if you use the use by composite feature here. I had a tile map that looked like this, very grid-like, hundreds of blocks, and I was experiencing really weird bugs with the player running along the tiles and then just bouncing up in the air every now and then. Turns out you have to use a composite collider, so learn from that mistake. Just check the use by composite collider and add a composite collider 2D collider to it. So you'll have a tile map collider 2D that's used by composite, a rich body that's static, and then a composite collider 2D. Yeah?
It's a little off the topic of tile maps, but what makes the glow effect?
Oh, that is post-processing. This specific here is bloom. I'm not gonna have time to get into that, but we can definitely do a visual effects and post-processing workshop.
What was the question? What was?
What
makes
makes
them
the
glow?
glow effect?
What makes the glow? Okay.
Is it like a material or texture?
Yeah, so there's two here. If you look at the little pole with the flag on it, that's a light. That's a 2D light. And the hazards are glowing because of the bloom effect. So that's a post-processing effect. I can show you how that would work after this. I have a screenshot of the game before and after post-processing. It makes a huge difference stylistically, but usually it's one of the last things you do on a game. As long as you make the art consistent, you can play with post-processing as a full-time job.
Bloom falls into a broad category of visual effects called shaders.
Mhm.
Bloom is a screen space shader, but it can be applied to anything. And we have a series on shaders specific to Unreal Engine, but the skills are completely transferable. You can find them on our YouTube channel. It's definitely one of the best videos that we have. It's a solid hour 45 minutes of just shader knowledge.
Sorry, but I was like, ooh, that's shiny. I just wanted to ask about
no,
it.
it definitely makes a big visual difference.
It's significant. It is.
Yeah, composite colliders for tile maps. For tile maps, you want to have a tile palette, so you can just go into create 2D tile palette, rectangular, and it'll create a tile palette. You can name the tile palette whatever you want, and then if you create a tile map, so like like this. You have some game object in the scene that is a tile map. In the tile map, you can assign the actual tile palette, and then after you've created the tile palette, when you are in the scene view, you'll see that little open tile palette window that's over there in the top right. You can click on it, and it'll show you all the tiles you have. You can either create tiles individually by running your File Explorer and going create 2D tiles, isometric rule tile, or you can drag a sprite into your tile palette, and it'll automatically generate the tile file for you. I find that to be a lot easier. But you can place them however you want in the palette, like a painter, and just go ham on them. And then sorting layers was another one that was brought up. Sorting layers let you guarantee the order that things in the game render. So if you have a foreground or a background, you want the foreground to be in front of everything and background to be behind everything. Usually, you want the player to be in front of enemies and behind visual effects. So you have to think about what elements in the game are behind or in front of each other. And you can do it without sorting layers by just using the number, like the numerical order. But you're quickly going to get into situations where you have tens or hundreds of objects that you have to define the sorting order, and it's going to get very complicated. Also, if you want to apply visual effects only to visual effects, you can make a visual effects sorting layer and only apply the visual effects or post-processing to that sorting layer. So the sorting order is first layers in order. So if you have foreground, everything in foreground renders in front of everything behind it. Then objects render in descending numerical order within the layer. So if you have something in the foreground layer with a value of 10, then that will render in front of foreground 9. And then finally, ties are resolved by the hierarchy. So if you have 5 enemies, the one that's lowest in the hierarchy window renders on top. All right, any questions about tiles or sorting layers? Yeah?
Oh, how do you recommend with the tile map colliders, if you have tiles that are like at slopes and not perfect squares, how do you like use that so the player isn't like levitating over a slope?
So Unity takes care of that more or less. I don't think I have a screenshot, but
That's a great question.
yeah, no, absolutely. So the hazard tiles here, the hitbox is a little jagged, but it goes something like this. Sort of follows the outline of it. It's a rough estimate. You can definitely tweak it in the actual editor. You can tweak the pixel art to match better, but Unity does a really good job of tiles, especially if you're working in like 16 by 16 pixel art. Unity does a really good job of adjusting the collider. It's not going to be a square every time. You might run into an issue where, for example, I don't know if you can see right here, this tile doesn't have the top right pixel, and so the hitbox is slightly curved, which is good for that situation. But if that's in the middle of terrain, the player might get stuck in that and jump up. So you have to be aware of it. You can tweak the art to prevent Unity from doing it, or you can guarantee that all your boxes are, all your tiles are box shaped to prevent it from happening. Yeah, input. It's going to get very complicated very quickly, but there's 2 input systems in Unity. The old input system and the new input system, very aptly titled. There are significant advantages to using the new input system, but there are a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want to use it as well. So both of them are very valid. Old input system is in Unity by default. It works without any setup. It doesn't really crash or run into too many issues, but it gets very messy very quickly. You'll find that by the time you're writing your 5th input, you're already looking at an update function of 50 to 100 lines of code. And if you have other things running in your update function than input, it might be very messy to work with. Also, if you're looking at, for example, controller support for stuff like platformers, it's nice to be able to play it on a controller as well as keyboard and mouse. Using the old input system makes using cross-platform more than double the amount of work, especially for touch. Whereas the new input system, it's a little bit of work to get set up, and it doesn't work in some specific situations. So, for example, if you use Unity Remote. So if you're developing a mobile game and you're running your game on your phone in Unity Remote plugged into your laptop, the new input system doesn't work through your screen yet. And Unity said they'd fix this. It's been 2 years and they haven't. So, but the new input system is by default cross-platform. So your game can be completely platform agnostic. Controllers, keyboards, mouses, VR controllers, touchscreen. Your game doesn't have to know what device it's running on. It does know what device it's running on if you need it for specific things, but it doesn't have to adjust the game based on what you're running it on. You can very easily change how input is run. So for example, if you want to only run the fire action after the player holds down the fire button for 0.3 seconds, instead of adding a counter loop in your update function that counts up to 0.3 and then runs the function, the new input system handles that by default. There's a lot more features that I don't have time to get into, but once you get the new input system set up, it is very clean and easy to tweak. Should have it again there. New input system you have to install from the package manager. You can just go into package manager, click input system, click install. It'll be in the game. Afterwards, you have to go into your project settings, go into player, and then scroll down to other settings section, and then in the active input handling, either select input manager new or both. I would recommend both because of the couple of things that don't work in the new input system. The old input system doesn't make your game slower by having it in the game. So you can keep both the input systems enabled and just use the new input system for everything you do. But the old input system has some very useful things like touch.count. How many fingers is the player holding the screen with? Could be very useful information to have at hand. Something to know is the old input system can get very messy if multiple scripts are accessing the player input. So for example, in a recent game, I had a central input class that handled all the input, and then one of the programmers didn't know about the existence of that class, and in a different class got the player's mouse input and changed the player's position of the mouse input. So in the game, the player is bouncing back and forth between the two positions, and it took us a couple hours to find the bug because two different scripts were accessing the same input and acting on them. Having input system automatically centralizes all of your input into one class called player input, which I recommend using. It's not required. You can use new input system without it, but it requires a lot more programming knowledge. New input system handles everything for you. You just add it to your player and set it up. You can click the, there's a create actions button in the player input. You click that, it'll create a new input actions asset for you. This is the editor menu that you can edit your input actions in. So you can have multiple different input action maps. So for example, UI and player is the default. This is what it'll look like after clicking actions before you edit it at all. This is what Unity gives you by default. It by default supports 5 different input systems. So it supports mouse and keyboard, touch, controller, joystick, and VR. But if you're in the UI, you have the UI action map. So you press space and it clicks a button, for example. And then you have the player map. So you press WASD and the player moves. And you can add as many bindings to these as you want. Maybe you want the game to pause on escape and P and I for some reason. You can add 3 bindings in here instead of writing 3 lines of code in old system. Yeah.
With this type of system, how would you have it so players can change their inputs? Like if they wanted to
Yes.
add extra lines?
So that is one of the huge reasons for the new input system. You can't do it in the old input system. There's no way to do it in the old input system that I'm aware of. I've tried. I'm sure it existed, but you wouldn't use the old input system. You'd use some third-party software that catches that old input system. In the new input system, there is a line of code that you can run that catches the next input of the user and then saves it in an asset. I don't have time to get into that here, but I can link you with the resource afterwards. But yeah, from here you can add all the input actions you want, and for each of the actions, you can define what type of action it is and what keywise it has and what map they belong to. So, for example, left stick on gamepad and hat switch on joystick. And then in the player input, if you make sure the behavior is set to invoke Unity events, you can add functions that get called automatically on input. So every time the player presses any key on any device that is bound to the move key, the move callback function is called, and you can make that any function. I would recommend having every function in here be a reference to a function in a script in the same object as player input. Otherwise, you move the player between scenes, and all of a sudden you can't pause the game anymore because you're accessing a reference that's not part of the prefab. Can lead to some nasty bugs, I know from experience. But yeah, here's all the code for firing and moving using the new input system. So handle fire context. When the player presses any key bound to fire, the handle fire context event is called. It catches the context, so you can check if context was performed or canceled, or a lot of other things as well that aren't as useful. But this makes it so that the fire action is only called when the player fires. Removing this will call fire when the player presses it and when the player releases it, which is very useful for a lot of things, not for firing. But you could also have an else if context.canceled, so you could have like an ability on press, an ability on release, all in one input function without any extra code. I recommend separating your input context handles from the actual function that does it, so that if you want to, for example, have fire be called by a UI button, you can without having to worry about the context. Yeah.
Okay. So right now, these are basically just like event handlers, like for input events.
Yeah.
Could you access the input values directly?
Yes. So player input catches all input from the game and filters it through your input actions. But the new input system does automatically have all the input that the player is giving, and you can access it directly from, I believe, input system devices.actions. It gets messy, and there's not a lot of reasons to do it, but yes, you can. That's why I recommend using the both option, because this cleans up your input significantly. But if you do want to know if the player is pressing escape when the escape isn't bound to a command, or if the player is touching the screen in 5 different points, you can use input.touchCount equals 5 or other old input system stuff.
Okay, but this system does seem a bit better that way. So like treating methods as like event handlers.
Yes, exactly. William says you have to write the functionality yourself in the old system. Yep. And yes, you could make the new input system work exactly like the old input system if you wanted to. Not a lot of reason to do it, but yeah. Make sure you're using Unity Engine input system. Make sure you're catching the context in an input action.callback context function. I recommend separating the actual functionality from the new input system callback. An example of somewhere where you don't care if it's performed or not is on move. If the player stops pressing the move key, context.readValue is going to return the vector 0, so your game is going to know that the player is not moving, which is very useful. Knowing that the player is not firing doesn't help much because that's the default state of the game. But yeah, you just drag and drop the input handles into the player input section, and the game will automatically handle all the input for you from now on. Very easy to modify, and all of these don't care what the input is. So once you have this set up, maybe you don't like having fire be on left mouse click, you can change it to be on the R key from the input actions menu without changing a single line of code. Which again, a huge theme of these developments is make things easier on your designers. You don't want to read through 100 different source files to find which one is accessing the player input and then change R to left mouse button. Yeah.
Is there benefit, or have you tested around with the different behaviors that are not invoked in Unity events?
If you're a hardened Microsoft developer, Invoke C# events might be nice. You can generate a C# class from your input actions file and then reference it directly through code. Send messages requires you to subscribe to the events that are being passed, which makes it easier to decentralize your input. So maybe your UI subscribes to your escape button press. So you can do on escape press plus equals close UI, for example. Invoke Unity events is the easiest to work with because it puts everything in the inspector for you to use. If you're a better programmer, then you could use the other ones, but they are strictly harder. Yeah, any questions about input, new or old? Yeah.
This isn't exactly on input, but it did. But I do have a question about classes. And I'm also not really sure why you might want to do this, but can you make a class in C# that won't be a game object nor a scriptable object?
Yes, you just remove the mono behavior line of code. For data, that's what you want to do. If you're storing custom data, you're making your own data structure, for example, you would not have it inherit from mono behavior, which makes it no longer instantiatable as a game object, but if you add the serializable tag to it, you can serialize it in the inspector. It's very useful. I use it all the time. Custom data storage, for example. Maybe you want to make sure that every game object that's stored has a tag to it. You could use a dictionary, but you can't serialize a dictionary, so you can make your custom data structure that stores a string and an int in a struct that isn't a mono behavior, and then you make a class that is a mono behavior, store a list of those structs that aren't mono behaviors.
Okay, and the script obviously just still shows in the project window.
Yes, yeah. Whether or not it's mono behavior doesn't affect how it shows up in your files.
Okay, thank you.
You want to say something? I mean, we're a bit over time.
Yeah,
but-
just a little bit, but it's only because we started late. But yeah, we're about at parity now with the late start. So
Okay.
yeah.
Singletons is like, Singletons events are the last section. So.
Oh yeah. No, go ahead. I'm not saying.
All right, sweet. I mentioned them multiple times during this presentation. Singletons, they are incredible. Some people hate them because a lot of novice programmers will make everything a singleton as soon as they find out about singletons, defeating the purpose of singletons. It's in the name, singleton. You don't want more than one.
How many of you know what a singleton is? Just to begin with. Okay, cool. So that's about like 50% of the room. That's good. Okay, so yeah.
A singleton is a class that is guaranteed to be instantiated and is guaranteed to be the only instance of that object. So for all intents and purposes, they're like a global variable, but not as bad as a global variable. And if you access a singleton before the instance is created, it creates an instance of that object for you, so that it'll never be a null reference. And if you try to create a new singleton instance, that new singleton instance gets deleted before it's fully instantiated. So you can confidently call, for example, singleton name.instance.function, and you know that it'll always run because there will always be a singleton instance in the game. And if there isn't, it'll be made.
So it's like a game manager kind of object?
Yes, game manager is a type of singleton. It's actually game manager Unity. It's one of the only scripts that Unity will change the script icon for. If you create a file called gamemanager.cs, Unity changes the icon to be a gear because it wants you to have a gamemanager.cs singleton by design.
What else can you use it for?
Data manager, if it has manager in its name, it should probably be a singleton. Spawn manager, audio manager, wave manager, prefab manager, game manager, UI manager. You can use it in a hacky way of preventing references. The player shouldn't be a singleton. That's a really bad idea, which I'm not going to get into why, but yes, there's only one player, but you can't guarantee that the player exists. For example, the player might not exist in the main menu, the player might not exist in a cutscene. What if the game is not multiplayer? You have to change your entire game from the ground up.
I was just wondering if you should use it for any of the like in-game elements versus.
So what's the question?
Like you shouldn't make like a boss a singleton.
No, absolutely not.
It's just for
You should not make a boss a singleton.
So singletons, if a good rule of thumb is if you're trying to visually represent a singleton, you're using a singleton wrong. They're strictly data, strictly connecting pieces of the game together, middleware.
That makes sense.
If you're trying to put an image on a singleton, you should question why it's a singleton. Yes, there may be only one boss in the game, but a singleton guarantees that it always exists. So if you make a boss a singleton, every level is a boss fight. It's not desirable. Yeah.
So both scriptable objects and singletons steal the data, but when would you use switch?
So scriptable object is a file, whereas Singleton is a game object. So Singleton is a game object that exists in your hierarchy, in the scene. Usually you want to predefine your singletons, and like make your singleton be a prefab with all the values initialized. Otherwise you're going to end up with 10, 50, maybe 100 lines of code of making sure your singleton gets instantiated properly. So when you instantiate the singleton, it gets a reference to this, and this value gets set to this, and so on. When you instantiate a singleton by default, all the values are 0, all the values are null. This is actually the full code for a singleton class. Yeah.
For a singleton game object, should there be like one per scene or one across all scenes?
So that is a per game answer. So some games, so here if you look at the top line of code on line 7, there's a variable called don't destroy on load. Setting this, so it's serializable, it's serialized field, which means it shows up in the inspector, so it's a checkbox in the inspector. If you set don't destroy on load to be true in the inspector, every time you switch scenes, the singleton gets moved to the new scene with all of its current data, which can be useful if your singleton is tracking, for example, the player's settings, the player's progress in the game. When you launch the game, it loads the player's progress from a save, and when you close the game, it saves it again, and that singleton is persistent across scenes. That's a very useful way. If you're making the game, though, you probably want to have one prefab of that singleton in every scene, so you don't have to launch the game in the main menu scene to move to the scene you're currently working in. If you only have the prefab in the main menu scene and you start testing in level 1, the game won't work because it'll spawn an empty singleton with none of its values initialized. So singletons should always be a prefab. Yeah.
For script references from earlier, they store persistent data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do they store data like across sessions?
Yes. They're sort of in a file.
Okay, so how would you store data within a session?
You definitely want to have a custom data structure, maybe a singleton. That's why I usually use this. Some singleton stores has player done this or whatever, and then that's saved throughout the play session. Then you do have to make sure to read those settings from a file at the beginning and write them to a file at the end if you actually want to save them. Yeah, what are you saying?
Nothing. Just, I think we should stop taking questions.
Okay, sure. Let's run through it really quickly.
Yeah,
But yeah, singletons, you can access them by using singleton.instance.value variable function, whatever. So GameManager.instance.isGameActive is something that Unity recommends having is the game running? Your game window might be open, but maybe you're in the main menu, the game is paused, you already died, etc. Should enemies keep spawning after the player has died? IsGameActive is a really good way to do it. When the game starts, Game Manager sets IsGameActive to true. When the game ends, Game Manager sets IsGameActive to false. Every single script in the game can access the current value of IsGameActive without a reference to Game Manager. That's the primary goal of singletons, is to avoid references, but it only works if there's only one of that object. So Game Manager, you don't want multiple game managers because you're only running one game. Player, you might have multiple players. Enemies, you might have multiple enemies. You can't guarantee that the level is going to be the same, etc. So I can show you an example after this of my default singleton setup. I usually have about 6 or 7 singletons, sometimes up to 9, depends on how complex the game is. But yeah. Also, if you use the singleton class from earlier, I'll post a link to that in the Discord as well. You can just instantiate, or you can create a new C# file, make it a class called Game Manager, for example, and then make it inherit from singleton, and it'll automatically implement the singleton design pattern. And then finally, events. This is the last section, I guaranteed. Events are signals within the game to notify other components about things that are happening. So events can be subscribed to or unsubscribed from. It's another way of agnostic communication without references, very useful to prevent spaghetti code. If something happens every time an enemy dies, you would use an event instead of figuring out every single enemy in the scene and every single thing that cares about enemies in the scene and then trying to connect the references. You can make an event. Every time an enemy dies, they call an event on enemy death. and everything that cares about enemies dying is subscribed to the event on enemy death. So static events can be accessed without a reference. So you can, if you have a static event such as on game start in the game manager, you can call game manager.onGameStart, and then your line of code will run whenever the game starts. So here's an example of a pressure plate and a trapdoor. Pressure plate is the event signaler. So it has, every event is composed of two parts, a delegate and an event. So public delegate void plate press, that's a function. So you could have it return anything else in void, and you could have any parameters within the parentheses. So for example, bool of is pressed. You just have to make sure that the event listener has the same exact parameters. Otherwise, it won't work. And the standard convention is naming it some verb, like plate press, enemy die, etc. And then the event is named on, and then the exact same name. So plate press, the event for plate press by convention should be on plate press. And for plate unpressed is on plate unpressed. And then when the event happens, so this is a pressure plate that has a trigger on it. When the player steps on this trigger, it calls the plate press, and when the player steps off, it calls on plate on press. In the event, you can have the question mark operator, which is null guarding. So if nobody is subscribed to the plate press event, the question mark stops plate press being invoked because its value is null. Without the question mark operator, your game will crash. You could also replace the question mark operator with another 1 or 2 lines of code, but this is what C# wants you to be using. So the dot invoke invokes the event only if somebody cares about the plate being pressed or unpressed. And then the second class is the trapdoor, which is listening to the event. It's subscribed to the event. So for every subscription, you have to have an unsubscription. So the way Unity recommends doing this is having an onEnable and onDisable function. When your trapdoor gets enabled in the scene for the first time, so whether that's spawned or the scene starts and it's already enabled, it subscribes to what it cares about. So this pressure plate trapdoor cares about the pressure plate that's connected to it being pressed or unpressed. If the pressure plate gets pressed, because of the plus equals open door, the on-plate press event will trigger the open door function, and the on-plate unpress function or event will trigger the closed door function. And for every subscribe, so that's a plus equal, you have an unsubscribe on minus equals. And you can do this in other functions than on enable and on disable, but you have to be very careful. If you're comfortable managing managing memory in C++, you probably know where you can and can't subscribe and unsubscribe. Not unsubscribing results in the memory leak, and subscribing in the wrong place results in the game crashing. So be careful. But yeah.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Thank you, Christian.
So events can be used to spawn objects too.
Yes.
Like, let's say, you kill an enemy, you can make events for that.
Yes, absolutely.
So we'll answer questions for another few seconds here. But yeah, just a few messages about the next meeting, right? So we have a schedule, right? And that schedule is a bit of a week-by-week schedule. For this next week, we're not going to do a workshop. We are going to have a game night. That game night's going to happen on Saturday, I think, at 7:30 p.m. We don't know what we're going to play yet, but that Google form is going to go out on the Discord in a little while. It's going to be virtual. Additionally, gym on Friday, I believe. Yes, we do go gym, 6:30 to 8:30. I think that's the plan. But yeah, thank you so much for coming out. If this was a workshop that you liked, awesome. If you want something else, if this wasn't what you're interested in, but you want this club to cover something that you are interested in, it is up to you to make that suggestion. We started this meeting by talking about the workshop suggestions that we received. We might cover character animation. It won't be in depth. We'll cover the artsy side of it, the technical side of it. Today was a much more technical presentation that maybe some of you in the audience that are more, from digital arts and sciences perhaps don't have the same like interest in as you might the character innovation workshop. So it's up to you to propose those suggestions, and we'll do our best to make them happen. So yeah, that's what I want to leave everyone with, I guess.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah. If there are any other questions, also,
I have a question, Loki, about the last slide, but
if there's any specific part about something that I talked about today, you can reach out to me on Discord and ask more questions about it. I'd be happy to hop on Discord one-on-one and talk about it.
PowerPoint and recording will be uploaded as well within a couple days.
That's a question? Okay, sweet. You had a question?
I did. So right here, private pressure plate. So in order to access the event definition, you need to instantiate a new private plate as like a class inside of your trapdoor.
Not
Sorry,
quite.
Not
That's a
instantiated. Reference, right. So you just generate a reference, but it's not instantiated. You haven't initialized
So
it.
in the game, within the scene, you would have a object of pressure plate,
Sure.
and then you'd have an object of trapdoor, and then the trapdoor, in the inspector of the trapdoor, you would drag and drop the pressure plate instance that it's subscribed to. So
I see.
this
and
trapdoor,
serialized field exposes it to the inspector.
right? So instead
Gotcha.
of
Okay.
instead of using public, so serialized field private is the same as public, except in code. I would recommend, if your function is public, ask yourself why. There are a lot of times that you want to use public, but I would say unless you can explain to me why your function or variable is public, it should be private. You have to be able to explain why something is public. And so if you want to access something in inspector, you could make it public, but you should make it serializable private instead, unless another script should have the ability to directly modify that value through code. It shouldn't be public. Yes?
What are good reasons to make it public?
Function calls, like open and close door, maybe another script wants to open or close the trapdoor. Maybe the player beats the level and every trapdoor in the game is unlocked. You might not want to lock that functionality behind being private. Things that are safe, so functions that don't require to be called from a specific context to work can be public safely. So if, for example, you have a function in the player called handle fire repeat, which expects the player to already be firing and have a specific type of weapon, etc., and is expected to run for a certain duration, that should be a private function, because if you call it from outside of the context, you're like, oh, I want the player to repeatedly fire, you call the function from the wrong context, and the game breaks because the player is not firing, and you call the function that expects it to be fired. That should be a private function. The actual fire function that takes care of the entire firing process can be a public function, because maybe you want some part of the game to force the player to fire, or you want the UI of the game to be able to make the player fire, etc.
It's basically about context.
Yeah. So private variables and functions protect you and everyone else working on your game from making mistakes. Having things be private stops you from accidentally calling the function in the wrong context, expecting it to do something completely different than it does, because you wrote it 2 weeks ago and you don't remember exactly how it works anymore.
wait, so in the general chat, William has been answering a number of questions. He also made a couple of comments in our chat. He says, FYI, I find serialized field plus private field with no public property an anti-pattern. So he's critiquing you, but that's okay.
Sure.
William always has very good insights to offer.
What's an anti-pattern?
Well, that's.
What did he say? Like, what did you just say?
So you know how he did a serialized field where he exposed a variable to the inspector. I believe. I'm not familiar with Unity. I'm doing my best though.
You're good.
To like edit it on that object. So like when you drag and drop the object into the scene, you can then edit that property of the object.
So having that inspector property be public means that anyone who has a reference to that object with that public variable can change the value of that public variable. So maybe you have a A class that has a reference to a prefab in it to spawn that prefab. If that reference to a prefab is public, any script in the game can change what that prefab is, which could be a good thing. But if your designers are expecting this thing to spawn a projectile, and some designer who didn't read the docs goes in and programmatically changes the value of that prefab to instead be another enemy, it's going to take you a couple weeks to find that bug, because in the editor, everything looks to be fine, everything's initialized correctly, but some programmer made a mistake that they couldn't have made if it was private. So like I said, if you don't have a reason for it to be public, it should be private, because it just avoids issues for no extra cost.
I mean, I thought I heard something about like serialized field and then making a public property.
Oh, no, never. No. Serialized field is specifically for private variables. Serialized field public, it should give you a warning.
Well, that's the thing. Sometimes what I do is I make a particular value, like maybe like some integer value.
Mm-hmm.
I guess not like a game object reference. I make a particular game object value serialized field, but I also make it private, and then I make a public getter.
Yes, that's a good design.
Okay, just not a setter. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can have a public setter as well. The big thing there is, if you have a public setter, you know who is setting it. If you have a public variable, you can't get a reference to every time that is changed, so you'll have to read through your entire game's source code to find who and what is changing the value of your public variable. So public functions are more or less good. Public variables are very dangerous, unless it's like a data storage class. If you have a struct that stores data, having all the values be public just makes sense. There's no need to have setters when the point of the data structure is that you can set things directly without using functions.
Okay.
So I think that's it for today. You're all more than free to go, but please do reply to the announcement that we'll send out about, do we have anything at all? No, okay, just some shenanigans. But yeah, please, we'll make an announcement about game night, and we'll find something to play. In the past, we've done Splitgate, we've done a Rocket League tournament, we've done private Minecraft Hunger Games server. Pretty fun stuff. So yeah, thank you so much for coming out today, and please propose more workshop suggestions, because we will be covering them in the future. Yep, that is all.
Yep, thanks everyone for coming.
My head is full.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this